Welcome to the Art of Growth and our panel season on Enneagram stances and attachment styles. This is the Type 4 panel. Before we get started, if you'd like to process the Enneagram and your growth journey with others on the path, consider joining the Art of Growth community. This is the best place to meet up with other Art of Growth listeners as we support each other in our becoming. You can join today at www.theartofgrowth.org. Theartofgrowth.org is also the place to take a free Enneagram test, a free Enneagram Instincts variant test, or to reach out to us for individual coaching or organizational coaching and consulting. There you can reach out to Joel Hubbard or me, Jim Zartman. In this podcast series, we build on the work we've done in other panel seasons on Enneagram type and instincts. All right, here we go.
Well, welcome to the Type 4 Stances and Attachment Styles podcast. I am so excited to have each of you here. And before we jump in, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, tell us your name and where you're from.
I'm Carly. I am from Denver, Colorado.
I am Greg, and I am from Topeka, Kansas.
I'm Maria, and I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And I'm Louis, calling it from Paris, France.
Woohoo!
Yeah, from the Midwest to France.
Well, I'm Midwest to Spain at the moment.
Yeah,
we've got a couple
You're
of us
in
here.
Spain right now. Yeah.
I'm in Spain.
That is amazing. We used to do all these recordings in our studio, so we'd have to find local people. And it's so really exciting that we can do this together.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive in. You've been thinking about this for a little bit. We've been thinking about it for a little bit. But really, this is sort of an exploratory conversation. We really are researching. We're wanting to know how stances and attachment styles work by type. And so what we're looking at are the three stances. We're calling these stances at or against, toward, and then away. They're called different things, different teachers, but roughly we're talking about similar things. We're talking about the 3, 7s, and 8s who tend to be against, and the 1, 2s, and 6s that tend to be more toward or dutiful in their approach, and then those who are more withdrawn or away. These are the stances that help us to get our needs met. At least that's the theory, is that this is how we get our needs met within our close relationships. And attachment styles is the same sort of idea. How do you get your needs met within those relationships? Are you secure in your relationships? Are you preoccupied and anxious, meaning you're kind of looking to someone else to meet your needs? Are you sort of pulling back and away, so you're avoidant? Or in that fourth category of disorganized, which that's the one without real strategy. So what we want to do is to begin just by putting that out to you to tell us, what is your starting stance and how does it show up? Also, if you include not only your type, we already know you're a 4, but your instinct as well, your dominant instinct. That would be helpful. So who would like to start?
Well, I'm primarily a social 4. I am firmly within the withdrawing stance. I am securely attached. So that's my particular mix.
Wonderful. So talk to me about, and maybe say a little bit more about that, and each of you as well. Like, how do you see the withdrawing stance helping you to meet that need? Because for a lot of other types, it's like, how does withdrawing actually help you to feel connected or loved or, getting your needs met in relationship with someone else?
Yeah. Well, for me, there are really two functions to withdrawing. And the first one is one that I go to in injury, which is when something hurts socially. I go inside myself for a little bit. Sometimes I'll literally remove myself. I kind of disappear to another room. I'll, what have you. Sometimes the person I'm with may have no idea that I've done it. But what happens inside me is it's sort of like, my default setting is to be very vulnerable, very open. Everything is just right there and very genuine. And when I've been injured, it's kind of like some of those doors close. And you may or may not know that those doors have closed. But inside my head, depending on how deep the hurt is, there may be a part of me that says, you no longer get to know what I think. You don't get to know what I feel. And so there are parts of myself that I keep to myself, even if socially I appear the same. But I might look a little more polite. I might look a little more, I don't know. I don't want to necessarily say on ceremony, but something has closed inside. So that can be a place I go to when I've been wounded interpersonally. The other purpose of withdrawal for me, I think, is it has to do with my relationship with myself. And this is coming just from a place in terms of, am I in good space with myself? I really enjoy my time with myself. I use it well. I do have a very rich internal life. And so for me to be functioning well, I need to have that time that is apart and away where I can be alone with my thoughts and nurture that relationship as well.
So I'm hearing something really good here. And I just want to say a couple things. And this will be helpful for the rest of you in terms of what I'm picking up on, and see if you're picking up on the same thing as it applies to your own lives, is that there's a protective nature to it. And so the withdrawing stance has that protective piece component to it. And then there's sort of like a really good part as well, which I would say the protective is also good. Sometimes it's overplayed, sure, but it's also very smart. It knows when to pull back. And then there's also the sort of nurturing component. Like this is where I kind of do this, like taking in some stuff, and it's really helpful to me. So that's a positive aspect of it. In terms of the meeting of the need, how does it do that part? How does it sort of meet the need that you have in terms of the relational component? And if it doesn't, that's also very interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, for me, it'll typically do a couple of things. One is that it helps me re-regulate. In the time when I have pulled away, I'm able to get my thoughts clear. I'm able to distract if I need to distract. I'm able to self-soothe if I need to self-soothe. So that part is helpful so that when I do return, I'm in a better space than if I'm completely dysregulated. The other thing sometimes is that depending on who it is, if I'm talking about, my intimates in life, the door is open for them to join me in that space. And so there's a period of separation, and then you can come through that door. And that's where a lot of reconciliation happens. That does presume a little bit that the other person wants to come in through that door, because there is the risk that someone could say like, okay, see ya. That has not been my experience, within my family, so that's helpful. But yeah, if someone were really avoidant, that could be more of a risk, which is that you just sit in that space by yourself where it could become more painful and feel more alienating. Yeah. Rather than a place of like, okay, now let's talk this through and work it out.
Yeah. Awesome.
So if the withdrawing doesn't work out in the way that you'd hoped, where do you go next? Do you go more at, or do you go more toward next?
I would go more toward, I think. Yeah. I mean, I'm very verbal by nature. I'm very relational by nature because I am a social four. And so I like to kind of sit down and hash it out. And so usually at that point, though, I can come back, yes, with my vulnerability. So I'm not as guarded and the doors aren't as closed as they were. But then I can be more regulated in my talking about it. So I'm not as, dare I say, hysterical. I can, kind of come from a place that's a little bit more balanced.
So what does it take, or what does it look like for you to actually move into that against more aggressive stance?
The aggressive stance is not familiar terrain to me. That's a really foreign way of being in the world to me. I can be a little bit more that way professionally, perhaps, in taking more of a leadership role within the relationship as I do as a therapist. But that's just not where I live.
So we'll come back to that, because towards the back end of this, I want to look at how the at stance works or the against stance works, because in some cases you're already doing it, but it doesn't feel very against, but it's sort of the boundary kind of approach to life. It has a little bit more boundaries, a little bit more guarded, not guarded in the sense of the withdrawing sense, but like, you're there, I'm here. Let's create some clarity in terms of our relationship. So, and I'm sure you've already done a lot of that, but we'll come back to it. But I understand what you mean by that. What's your second instinct, by the way, in the stacking?
A bit self-pres.
Okay, very good. So I'd love to hear from the rest of you, because I saw some smiles. It's like, well, some of you I know have a little bit more access to that againstness. So
Yeah. So yeah, as you know, I am a 4. My dominant instinct would be sexual. I also identify with the away or withdrawn stance being my go-to, even though I am seeing that evolve over time. In terms of strategy of how it actually helps me meet my needs, I can see a couple of things in varying degrees of healthiness. Is that the default for me is that withdrawing for me is a way of kind of simulating the pattern of abandonment that I'm trying to get out of. And it is a way for me to set you up to come and get me. So in a relationship, withdrawing gives you the opportunity to come and save me and to come and give me the attention that I so crave. And as a kid, if I was sad or upset, I would usually tend to withdraw for that reason. For obvious reasons, I've been tending to do that a lot less as I'm growing up, because it is just not an effective strategy, but it is kind of the default. And I have to get myself out of that ditch when I see it happening, but it is kind of the default strategy. It's also, like you said, Mariah, it's kind of a way for me to regroup for many reasons. First, relationships can be very exhausting to me, both because I sometimes get really intense in relationship and I am either on or off. For example, like when we have people over for dinner, I will often disappear for like 10 to 15 minutes. And for my loved ones, that is just a given. They know me really well, and they know that it's a natural part of my cycle and that it's important to give me that time, because the quality of my presence, if I do not allow myself that time to withdraw, will go down and down and down until I become, 1, really unhappy, and 2, a little bit of a pain in the neck. So they kind of know to respect that space. I think it's also a way for me to disengage from the heart-mind loop when I get really stuck in it. Because when I go into full crisis mode, because, for example, I don't know, if I'm meeting like a group of people where I don't know all that many people, I might go into panic mode a little bit. And from experience, I know that I am not able to get out of that in the situation. I have to withdraw, regroup, come back to the body, take a deep breath in, a deep breath out, and then come back. But it is useless for me to try and force it in the situation.
Okay, you have to pause there, because you've dropped some amazing insight. Like, I'm sitting there going, oh my God, wait. This is like mind-blowing here.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One is, wow. So let me see if I can track with all of it. I'd be curious if this is true for all 4s, is like the amount of intensity you live with. Now, sexual 4 is just amped up a little bit more, I would suspect, just because of the instinct. But the amount of heart involvement in what it is you do when you're with people is so intense that it does require a recovering from that. It sounds that that's pretty true for a lot of 4s. So that's an interesting perspective. But there's a withdrawing that you're describing that seems that you've learned to harness that in a good way, because there's a kind of withdrawing, as you know, you've already alluded to, Maria, and many 4s will describe this withdrawing as a way to escape. And then you end up in the head heart loop. You're describing it as it helps me to get out of that sometimes. So it seems like the withdrawing, if it's not done well, if it's not done with sort of like intentionality, you can end up, it sounds like, in that sort of even more of the head heart loop. But with intentionality, you're talking like breathing and recognizing something, self-regulation, so that you're able to come back in. Am I getting at that? And I'd love to get like your thoughts and feedback on that. Yeah.
The word that really came to me when you kind of repeated it back to me is, in its unhealthy format, it's basically about wallowing in whatever I'm going through. And that kind of withdrawal is completely useless. I just get deep and deeper down into that inner like 4 spiral that really doesn't get me anywhere. And yeah, when I learned to harness it with a lot more presence, instead of being here to wallow, I am here to, well, first regroup and then to delve deeper. And that's kind of the third point I wanted to get to, is that the withdrawn space is the one in which I gain clarity in the heart and mind in order to be true to myself and to others in thought, word, and action. And that is something that I need a lot of alone time for. And I'm kind of realizing this as I go. Like, for example, if I get in a fight with my partner, I have been studying for this fight. Like, I know exactly what is going on with me. I know exactly what is going on with you. And I have delved really deep. And sometimes he tells me, like, Louis, you have to realize I do not take like hours each day to write down my thoughts and my feelings and think about it and try to understand them. And I've learned to see that as a huge resource. Like, yeah, I just spend a lot of time each day thinking about all of this in order to gain clarity and to find truth. And I think it's kind of where all of that is produced. It's that withdrawn space. It doesn't really happen in interaction.
This is so good. So I want to hear from the others as well on this. But like one last thing in terms of that is you were saying something similar to this, Maria, as well, is that it helps you to come back to the conversation, helps you to come back to the relationship in a way that then helps you to be able to engage it in a wholehearted way, in a way that's actually beneficial to the relationship as well as to yourself. And I love that. So that's helpful, I think, also for many people who know fours, are in relationship with fours, to understand what's happening and to see the value of that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
But since we asked Maria, I do want to ask you as well. Then Louis, what do you go to second? And then how about for you? What comes after that?
I would say the aggressive stance is definitely the second go-to. It used to get me into a lot of trouble as a kid because it's just the secondary response to the same problem of abandonment. If I feel like I'm not existing in this space, I will be loud enough for you to hear me. And if that's still not loud enough, I'll be louder and I have no limit. I do now. I feel that as the sexual instinct pushing also of being more intense until I get my needs met. I've also learned to tone that down a little bit because it's also not a very effective strategy, but I guess that would be the second go-to.
So what does it take for you to get to the toward stance? Like, what does that look like?
I'd say it probably doesn't really happen anymore in terms of like an unhealthy accident. What would happen before is that I feel like I'm completely losing my grip in terms of feeling connected to people. It's kind of a last resort.
Yeah.
Like, I may just bring the whole thing down with me because I'm already sinking. But now I guess the way it shows up is probably learning to see the excess, like just having that awareness of the excess that I can have in the withdrawn stance. And when it goes too far, I know to bring myself back into action, to do first and wallow later. And I guess the add again stance helps a lot in that regard to get me out of my inner space, which sometimes just get like sticky and unhelpful.
I love that. It's almost like a self-deceiving trick. You can wallow. I'll give you permission to wallow. You'll just do it later. And you were going to get into action right now. Well, let's hear from the other two, right?
So I'm a self-pres 4, and I really appreciate what both Maria and Louis was saying. A couple things stood out that I relate to. I really think it all depends on the situation I'm in, who I'm in it with, if it's my personal life or my professional life. And then those sometimes bleed over into each other. I'm a social worker, and so I work really closely with people in groups, but also individually and generally in crisis or in some of the hardest times of their lives. I work in medical healthcare, medical social work. And so I feel like I cycle through some of my stances and instincts. I definitely live in that withdrawn state when I'm healthiest. As a self-pres, I just really self-protect. I need to have a good space around me where I can breathe and not be cluttered in my thoughts. And there's a lot of self-soothing, whether it's music and things that just kind of give me peace and grounding, my plants and being really organized, stuff like that. And I do that so that I can be in space to go towards people when I feel that they need it. But I often go towards people while also completely hiding myself. And, you know, it's like this vulnerability that I show them enough in order for them to also be vulnerable. But there's a huge wall up as far as what they're really getting to see about me. And so it's kind of that push-pull, I think, quite a bit. So sometimes I think, you know, when I think about my partner, sometimes I think I'm attempting to go towards, and I absolutely have all the language in my head, and I've absolutely really thought it out and, tried to think of it from his perspective and my perspective and how he must be feeling and how would I best be able to go connect with him without, setting him off in a different direction. And I go through all these thoughts. What I don't realize is that when I'm doing that, sometimes I'm actually going at him and not towards and not connecting like I thought I was. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy of this thing I didn't want to do. And when I get to that point and I see that wall that I'm hitting, which was the exact opposite of what I wanted to do, I will withdraw again and I will physically remove myself from the room and can be pretty emotional, like those emotions that I was trying to avoid just come out in privacy, I want to be away. But there is absolutely a part of me that is hoping, okay, I need you to come towards me and release me from this because I can't do it anymore. I don't know what to do. And, we've been married 10 years this week, actually, and together about 18 years. And so we've really learned this dance well. And I would say we do have a very secure attachment, but this dance used to be uglier. And now it's just understanding the space that we need to be in and recognizing this was my attempt and giving best intentions and understanding our best intentions. And so at some point I can then go back towards, and then I really am towards. I got through all of that emotion and even just some of that physical release, if I was crying or something, I got through all of that and now I can really connect. And so for me, it's in those interpersonal relationships, it's this whole thing I go through. But in my professional relationships, you're never going to get through all that. You're just I'm going to be there for you. I will use my own vulnerability if I think it's going to be a tool to help you connect. But in practice, as a licensed social worker, you also, you're not supposed to, you are protecting yourself. It is about the other. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It plays with me sometimes.
Well, there's one thing that you said in there that it's just highlighter, because if you aren't very familiar with the type 4 and you've never seen this before, or I've heard this from partners before, is that they're very confused by something you said where you're talking about how I think I'm going towards and then I realize I'm actually going against or at. And one, I know a lot of 4s that don't have that level of self-awareness. They don't realize they're actually coming at, they think they're coming toward. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. How do you realize that? How did you learn that? Because I think that that's huge.
I feel like I can recognize it when I start seeing the response that I'm getting. One, it's not meeting my need. I can just tell I'm not hitting the target. I'm not getting what I was hoping to get from it. So I just realize I'm not connecting the way. But two, just reading other people really well and its subtleties in body language and expression. And in my work, I have to build really quick rapport with people in a very vulnerable time in their lives. And you can just tell when that wall is shut or when someone's like, oh, thank you. Thank you so much for creating and holding this space for me that I can now explore all these feelings. And when I think of going towards someone, that's what I think of, being able to hold a space for them. Maybe not even so much a space for myself, but them. And then I feel safe enough to also move in a little bit more.
Wow.
So when you're saying you're going against, is it sort of a kind of drawing boundaries? You're kind of pushing the person away? What is happening there?
It's both, and it's boundaries. It's drawing them or pushing them. It's push and pull again. I will use at and against in advocacy as well, because you have to fight for people to get their needs met in the system in which we live in healthcare. And so I will get really at and aggressive, but with the best intentions. And so, you can go too far with that.
Yeah.
So it truly is this just constant. I'm always thinking of an accordion, just in and out.
Yeah, sure. That's a good metaphor. Yeah. What's your second in the instincts stacking for you?
It's social. I definitely have gone back and forth on that between sexual and social. I think that I use all three, I oscillate between them all day long, whether I am doing, the self-pres part of me is my self-care and protection so I don't get burned out in the work that I'm doing. the social part of me is working within the groups. I run a number of support groups, and I work with a certain population of people and create resources for that population, and really think about the betterment of healthcare for. I work with stroke patients. And so what can I do in that world and bring that community together? And then when I'm with my patients or their care partners in the hospital, in that, very early stage of crisis, I am one-to-one connection as much as I can, trying to help ground them and trying to help them become present, because, they've disassociated from their loved one dying on the bed next to them potentially. And so it's really honing in on that. So I feel like I move between all of them, but I feel safest and healthiest in self-pres. And it just resonates so much more with me. I think it's the only thing it's what grounds me.
Greg.
I am a social 4, and like everybody else, I go to with. But the words I would use for me, when I get into a situation where I feel like I am not enough, where I don't have the wherewithal, or I'm being judged and that shame gets triggered within me, I withdraw for protection. And then I've got a pretty strong wing 5. So I do think and feel and work it out. But I actually make progress. And when I back off, it's like any problem. When I face a problem and I hit a wall, when I back off, I've come to trust myself, because my thinking and feeling, when I'm in a safe space, these ideas of how to get past it come into my mind, and I can see pathways to get through it. So for me, the withdrawal is that not enough thing.
Yeah. And your social, what's your second in the stack?
It's sexual is my second.
All right. So you probably have a lot more, it sounds like a lot more extroversion or ability to be with people quite a bit. So I would imagine that the sort of withdrawn, how does that play into both of those instincts being very people oriented?
That's a great question. I think it's simply that I have to withdraw because of the intensity. So if I have these great conversations with family members, and I can do that for hours at a time, but then the next day I'm worn out, and I want that feeling, that rush, that oxytocin again with the closeness. But I realize that I'm kind of worn out. And in my work, I support adoptive parents who are raising children from trauma. And so I try to be there with compassion and with resources. So I've discovered on days where I've been encountering numerous people, whether training or coaching or whatever, I still want more of that, but I realize my body is just exhausted and my brain is exhausted. So that's a self-pres thing to withdraw as well. I mean, so that's the thing. And my second is I go at rather than with. So for me, when I've thought and felt and this path is revealed to me to which way to go, I go do it. And that caused a lot of stress in my marriage and with one of my daughters actually too, because I would just go. And my wife would get so frustrated at me because I would just go. It's like, why didn't you check with me? Why didn't you touch base? We're partners in this. I'm going, oh, that's right. So that's a thing. I have grown. So I actually do now. Once I get a path, I tell somebody that I trust, this is what I'm thinking. And I at least check it out with them. And they give me the thumbs up and I go for it.
Yeah. And you can definitely see that in the social/sexual or sexual/social tends to be kind of more about like, let's just move and make things happen. There's a little bit more of that within that. Again, it pairs up differently by type, but you can see a little bit more of that need for change and need for movement that shows up primarily through the sexual instinct. So that's really good. So let's move to attachment styles. Greg, I know you work with adoptive parents. So I'm sure you see this quite a bit in the work that you do. And I wonder how much self-reflection you've done on this as well. Like, what is my, attachment style? And, and is there sort of an order to them? Are you anxious, preoccupied, leaning more toward other people? Or are you more like, pulling back? How do you do that? And, are you in a place where you've moving towards secure attachment? Talk about that.
I am thrilled to say that I am moving towards earned secure. When I did the adult attachment interview, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was getting some training in trust-based relational intervention, I was preoccupied, entangled. And I could see that, and just sometimes avoidant, but mostly I'm preoccupied, entangled. So that push pull of come closer, and when I want you closer, and pushing away when I need my space. That unhealthy stuff was a reality for me.
Well, you're a great person to ask about this too, because I have really been wondering, and it's come up a couple of different times, this idea of this push and pull, because the push sounds a little bit more like that anxious attachment, and the pull away sounds a little bit like the avoid dismissive, and I don't think that necessarily means that fours are disorganized, like inherently, because it can be securely attached. But how does that push pull play into attachment when that also is just kind of an aspect of the four, nature of the four, like that I need to move in toward relationships and I need a little bit of space and pulled away to re-identify, to regulate, to use all the good things that you guys mentioned about withdrawing. But you also want to lean towards relationship. You're a relationally motivated people as a type 4. So I've been wondering how that push and pull of a 4 plays into the attachment style.
I'm going to paint a little bit of an ugly picture, but the way I look at it is that I'm most definitely anxiously attached, and the pull part of it is kind of the one you would expect. So I don't think I need to go into too much more detail about that. But pushing people away is, first, there's something I experienced a few weeks ago. Like, if I am in a new relationship, my focus is on proving to myself that I am worthy of your love and attention. Once you give that to me, you are no longer an interesting person to get to interact with that pattern of mine. So this is really unhealthy for obvious reasons, because it leads me to pushing away people who are seeing me for who I am and who are totally willing to participate in a loving relationship. But yeah, there's a sense of, if you do love me, based on the flawed perception I have of myself in point 4, that probably doesn't say great things about you. And okay, bye. I'll just move on to the next person. Did you get my meaning? I'm not sure I'm being clear here.
Yeah, you're very clear. Yeah.
And people I have known for a long time, I've played this game with for a little bit. And at some point, I actually truly get the message, oh my God, there's so much more to be lived here in the space with you than just proving or disproving stupid patterns. And all of that moves away, and I can get into an actual beautiful relationship. But it takes a little bit of time before that push and pull game goes away. And also, there's also this thing of the same thing I said before about abandonment. Like, pushing somebody away can also be a test to see if they'll come back. So, I mean, to me, very consistent with the anxious attachment.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if any of you relate to that or would nuance that differently.
Well, yeah, you can see, I'm actually different than that. And I wonder if the difference is in the placement of the sexual instinct. I don't like that kind of intensity. I don't experience myself as pushing, pulling, that those aren't words that I would use. But I think what I do is I try to be constantly calibrating intensity, actually. And so when I love someone, it is big, it is deep, it is intense. And I don't want to have some massive pendulum swing of any kind. I don't like that. That doesn't feel good to me. And so I'm always kind of constantly calibrating what feels like too much. Do I need to just, you just kind of slowly modifying that. But I worry less about abandonment, then the way I'm more likely to experience it is kind of like, if I love you, I will kill you in my mind. And what I mean by that is I don't think there is anybody that I have ever really truly loved that I haven't lived through their death 1,000 times, because I can imagine the feeling of the grief of that. And it's big and it's intense and it's all tied up in how much I love you. And that feels really big to carry around all of the time. I just can't do that. So I guess, I identified earlier when we was talking about, how he, disappears at various points and, parties and what have you. I will disappear at some point. And that's true whether I'm doing it because I'm having a shame reaction or just because I'm loving you all so much. But I need to keep that balance for myself, because what doesn't feel too heavy in any given moment, I've got a lot of emotional strength in any given moment that I can do a lot of emotional heavy lifting. But at some point or another, you have to set that down or it's too much. And so that's what I find myself doing. So I don't experience it so much like, okay, I want to push you away right now. It's more felt as I need to be invisible for a little while so I can breathe and just be. I don't want you to go anywhere. If you're one of my people, I want you close forever and ever and ever. But I just need to disappear for a while. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I just use different language, maybe. I don't know.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to the nuance of the social instinct especially when you talked about constantly calibrating intensity. So that calibration is that mechanism of the social instinct is that calibration. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. And
it will show up. I mean, I still hear the push and pull, but it sounds, and I still hear the intensity of the up and down, but it's expressed differently. And I think that's very true of the way it shows up differently from the sexual to the social as your dominant instinct. And I would imagine to the self-preservation as well. So this is what's fun about this, is because there's such variety among the fours, particularly with the instincts, to the degree that in some cases it's like, oh, I would never do that. Like, and we'll hear that in panels. It's like, oh no, I would never do that. That doesn't sound like anything I would. And so no two fours will see each other as a four because of that distinction. Sometimes that can be very stark, but there's still that thread that's being woven through that comes from the sort of core pattern of the four. So that's really insightful. Greg, Carly, anything else to?
Maybe it's a really four thing. You both had mentioned like a pendulum swinging and the push and pull. And for me, like, I don't see the pendulum swinging and pushing people all the way away. I don't even really see it about the other person. I see it about me. And like, I go towards, I move back, I go towards, like, you have nothing to do with it on the other side. And that might be a very four in my own head, maybe a little self-absorbed thing. I don't know, in my emotions, living in that. And it's just like, how vulnerable am I willing to go or not? But I do feel like my closest relationships and friendships, I feel very secure in those. They're not going anywhere. I'm the one that is going in and out. And I feel like the people who know me closest are okay with that. You know, when Carly's had enough, she leaves and it's not a big deal. And it's like, hey, I love you, but I got to go now and I'll see you next time. Done. And the only time I will go towards is if I feel like, oh, now someone's in trouble or someone needs something even more beyond myself. And then I will uncomfortably sacrifice my self-pres energy and say, okay, I'm gonna persevere through the push forward towards you. If that makes sense. I see a strong.
Yeah, right. It makes a lot of sense to me. Well, what I'm hearing, if I'm putting it together, the pieces in my head, I'm hearing the sexual, like talking about that push and the pull, like I am actively doing something, change the distance. With the social, it's just kind of like I'm calibrating. And with the self-pres, like, no, I'm not really pushing or pulling anything. I'm the one who's withdrawing or then leaning back in. It's really about me. So I'm hearing all three of those nuances, distinguishing it just slightly differently. Well, from an outside observer, they may not really understand the difference, but you all are providing us with a language and a context, which it really is a different experience for you.
One of the things that language, the Enneagram, the wisdom of the Enneagram has given me this delightful thing that has made me aware and give me words. So I recognize why I want to pull away, is that it's given me a sense of self-awareness, whether it's shame and I'm feeling like not enough, or whether I'm exhausted. And the second part of that is the self-compassion. So my pushing and pulling are more gentle now. So I don't shove people away and I don't yank them close, because I think I really did that in years ago, probably not that many years ago, but everything's more gentle now because I've got this self-compassion of this is who I am. So there's more of a flow to withdrawing, and there's more of a flow to coming back rather than a yanking. So that's just been a helpful thing for me, that self-compassion and the awareness.
I think I want to highlight and underscore that. That's a marker of transformation and growth right there. This is not something that is a throwaway, line here, because the ability to understand that dynamic, how flow versus fight becomes a shift that takes place within all of our types as we begin to grow and transform. And it doesn't mean that the way we go about life changes altogether. You stop being a 4 and now you're an 8 or a 7 or whatever. It doesn't happen that way. But what happens is there's more of a gentleness, a more self-compassion, more of an ability to kind of, here's where I began, but I don't need to stay here and I don't need to end here. I can begin to turn and move back in a different direction. There's a lot of that I'm hearing in what you're saying, and that's really helpful. And I think this is a great pivot to move us towards how we actually grow and in the ways we're growing. And I would love to hear that. You've already touched on some of those things. And so go ahead and maybe say a little bit more about it. How are you growing? How are you moving from your attachment style and moved towards secure? And some of you have already said, I'm in that place right now. I'm more in the secure attachment style. So maybe reflect on, how do you keep coming back to that secure attachment when you see yourself maybe pulling away? What are some of the habits you've learned? Same thing with the stances. What are you learning there to move you more towards what stance is necessary here in this moment, rather than the automatic, go-to, unthoughtful, unconscious mostly. So maybe say a little bit about that.
I think for me, it's this awareness. And Greg, I agree, learning more about the Enneagram gave me an awareness and just definitions and words, things that I could use to identify the emotions that I was having. And having that awareness has allowed me to be just more proactive in my choices. I'm not reactive. I'm thinking about what I need. And it might not be what my gut instinct has been when I was younger, which was just really in depth in these emotions and feeling all of this. And now it's what I need is to go for a walk. What I need is to get into my body and move and get out of this cycle of emotions that's spinning in my head, because I can come back to that will be there. But if I can get out of my head for a minute and calm and create a space for me to come back to it in a healthier mindset, I have so much more choice in what I do with it at that point, and things are so much clearer for me. And so that's where the growth has been for me, is being able to put words to this, being able to see myself in the way that other people are talking, and, do I do that? And what does that look like for me? And how do I feel about it? And how are other people receiving that? Instead of just sitting in the emotion, just being really sad or really detached or...
I definitely resonate with coming back to the body thing. Lately, I'm trying to really set up that trigger of, if I am getting stuck, the immediate response needs to be to go to the gym, because nothing else works. I always think of this in terms of the space in which a problem arises cannot generate a solution. I need to go somewhere else, and that somewhere else is the body. And I do not believe for a minute that it's going to work when I do it. But now I've learned to kind of overwrite that. I know that in that space, I lose even the awareness that going back to the body is going to do me good.
Yeah.
So I remain withdrawn, but it's a healthier withdrawal. I take time for myself, but for the body instead of the heart and mind. So I think that's definitely one big thing is that, okay, the withdrawn stance remains my home, but maybe I can live in it in a healthier way. And it's still a big help, even when it's the source of my problem in the moment.
Yeah.
And I guess another thing I've been thinking about a lot these past few months, and this is resonating a lot with the inner line to 2, is that the with stance is a huge way for me to crawl out of my inner cave and actually turn my attention towards other people, ideally in service. So the first step is to ask for help, to realize that I may not have all the elements to get myself out of the ditch that I've dug myself into, and to really like just turn to other people and try to ask for help, and then try to focus on what I can do for other people, because I know that the pendulum has swung way too far in the direction of what can you do for me? And I'm becoming stuck in that place. And the with stance is a way of kind of turning that on its head and posing the question, okay, how can I be of service? How can I be of help? And that will be a better way to find secure attachment, because I cannot keep waiting for you to come to me. I need to make the first step. I need to get out there. I need to actually do something for you. It's very foreign for me, but yeah, I mean, it's work in progress, but I do think it's a really important tool.
You know, the whole thing Jim and I have been saying, if you're doing it right, it doesn't feel very satisfying. And so you just mentioned that like movement towards the body and how it does not feel like, even in the space when you're in the head heart loop, it's like, yeah, I don't believe that that's going to work. Right. Like that's not going to do anything. Right. That's exactly the feeling I have myself as a 7 when I have to do the thing of going into that other space, going into my heart. I can't imagine that's going to help anything, right? So that's a really good point. I think it's true for all of us types.
I just like to add one last thing. I've been trying to move away from the withdrawal strategy for a long time, and what I'm coming to realize is that it's one of my biggest gifts. And professionally speaking, what I'm learning to do is to invite people into that withdrawn space with me, and the depth that I've been cultivating for close to 30 years are there available as a resource for anybody that needs them. And inviting people into that withdrawn space is a really great way of honoring what I am and not trying to correct it, but also cultivating it in a way that is more generous and just personal fruit.
It makes me think of our need for authentic relationships too. And if you're bringing someone into that space to see that very vulnerable, authentic side of you, and they can share that with you, it's so much more meaningful than you going into a space that you don't really want to be in, or you're not as comfortable in, but you're going into it anyways to connect with people. It doesn't feel as authentic or rooted, grounded. I'd much rather have dinner at home with friends with really good discussion than going out dancing. I don't know. I don't do that. Bowling, something like that. Those are fun things to do, but they don't always feel as connected to me. And so it doesn't always fill my cup as much as if I invite someone into this quieter, where I feel safest. Always let a lot of people into that space. So
one of the places where I've really changed since when I was younger is, in my family of origin, my dad is a 9, my mom is a 6. And it was a very calm household. And we took care of each other's feelings very gently. And so if we were upset and fighting, an outside observer probably wouldn't know that we're fighting, although we would all know. And it was calm. And sometimes someone would cry, you'd sit and you'd share your feelings and you'd work it all through, and it would be very verbal. And then we feel better. And that has not worked in my adulthood, in my marriage, because I'm married to an 8 who leans to the avoidant. He is not going to do that with me, which initially kind of pulled me almost toward an anxious attachment, because it's like, this isn't working. And I think what I'm learning as time goes by is that I actually don't have to do it that way. The marriage researcher, John Gottman, would talk about repair. And he said that, it doesn't always have to be some beautifully crafted emotional conversation, that sometimes it's just a goofy look or something that's really unsophisticated, and that's enough.
Yeah.
And what I've found being married to my avoidant 8 is that sometimes I forget to be upset. Like I'll start off really wounded and I've got a lot of words in my head. And then all of a sudden something happens because he's so oriented to the future that he's on, like, that was 5 seconds ago. I'm over that now. That he just kind of keeps on going. And I'll accidentally join him and I'll realize, like 12 miles down the road, like, oh, shoot, I was supposed to be upset about that thing you said to me. And I'm not. And that's very against the way I thought it was supposed to be, especially within my 4-ness. And so I think that's really good for me because I've realized I actually don't have to process every feeling the way I thought I did. So that's a really big change for me. I think just realizing that, I don't actually have to feel every feeling all of the way through. I don't have to talk every feeling all the way through. And part of that in accepting that, no, this is the person I'm married to is I think the concept of sort of, spreading things out a bit, that I don't expect all of my relationships to be that deep, satisfying, let's talk till 4 a.m. and explore everything kind of relationship. I have some of those, but others are not. And I don't expect that anymore from everyone, that, I have to get my needs met in many different places, not just with one person. And I think that's been really critical too.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's the wisdom of the stances, the ability to move more towards that withness of, oh, this person is more self-preservation, or this person, in the instincts, or this person is more withdrawn in the stances, or this person's more against or at in the stances. You start to pick up on these different, whether they're instincts or stances, and that ability to kind of say to yourself, even though this is not going to be deeply satisfying to me, this surprisingly, if I meet them halfway in the stance, my own need sometimes goes away, which is strange, right? It's a really strange thing. And transformational work, we all talk about this, that the need itself, if you feed it constantly, it just gets hungrier. It's just whatever that is. It doesn't. So sometimes the starving of it at the right time, like, no, okay, we're good. We have everything we need right here and right now. And we breathe around that, the need subsides. And there's this deeper connection that actually takes place, which is what we're all after. And it's very satisfying. So
I'd like to sort of pose a question. It's been very interesting to me to listen to you three having a different setup as a 4. And I feel like my anxious attachment and my feeling of being deeply flawed as a 4 are 2 monsters that feed off of each other so efficiently. And I am really wondering, like, if anyone has concrete tips or insights or anything from your experience to kind of break that cycle, because the feeling of being flawed kind of generates this anxiety and attachment. And this anxiety and attachment is such a terrible mirror of who I am as a person in a relationship. And it doesn't make me feel very good about myself for obvious reasons. And yeah, that cycle is just so damn hard to break sometimes. I don't know if 4s have it like worse than anybody else when they're anxiously attached. Obviously, I like to think so, because when I'm unhealthy, I feel like I'm like the only, like I'm the most miserable person in the world. But yeah, I feel like it's just like 2 slippery slopes that cooperate in the most terrible way.
I think for me, I have a separation in my head between my feelings of unworthiness and effectiveness, which are, as a 4, completely present and intact, and whether or not I'm loved. That to me, fundamentally, love is not something that has to be earned. It just is in those primary relationships. I'm not nearly as clear on that when it comes to more peripheral relationships. But when it comes to my relationship with my parents, my relationship with my child, my relationship with my spouse, it's, I love you because I do. I can feel that in me. I don't love them because of anything they did or didn't do. They don't have to earn it. They don't have to be good enough. They don't have to anything. It just is. And so I guess for myself, I'm able more often to be able to accept that as well. That their love for me doesn't rise or fall on whether I'm good enough or not. That said, I may struggle with that in a whole bunch of other areas in those more peripheral relationships, but those core ones, that's the separation that I make. And I don't know, I don't know that it's necessarily easy to force oneself into that way of thinking about it, but that's what I do.
That's hugely helpful. Thank you.
I think some of it is changing the narrative in those tapes, those reels in your head from this like negative kind of self-talk or belief system. And I don't know that you ever fully get away from those, but if you practice enough to stop the tape, practice enough to say, wait, this is fueling this belief that I know I may feel to be true, but I know is not. And I need to stop that and actively work and go into action, go into movement towards the opposite of that. And that might be choosing to, you mentioned going to the gym and just getting out of that space for a minute so you can hold a space for a new narrative. I just feel like that's like an ongoing life work mission. I don't think you ever get to a place where that's no longer an issue, but I do think it gets easier and you can get quicker at hearing those old thoughts, those old beliefs that don't serve you any longer. That's that negative self-talk where I'm being mean to myself. I would never do that to someone else. I'm not going to do it to myself. Stop, just stop, kind of a thing.
Yes.
I think it's work and action.
Yeah. I would add just two things that I've talked to that's been universal for all types. And that is this is not specific to the four, but it's to recognize the core lie, right? It's to recognize the core lie. So there's a core lie and each type has it. And so when you're able to notice it and so you notice it in retrospect, that's the self-knowledge. But then there's the self-observation. Can you see it acting right now in the moment, in the heat of the moment? When you're engaged in a fight, almost none of us can because our reptilian brain takes over. And so we're in fight, flight, freeze mode and, we're done. And so sometimes when it gets to that part, you can't. But if you can catch it just before you end up to that point of tripping that, you can start to see how that's, okay, this is the message that I believe. That fundamentally I'm not enough. There's something about me. And so right now, how is that? Right now that's active. And so it's part of this problem that I'm experiencing. The second thing is to work. And I think Carly, you said is to work against your bias because your bias will seek confirmation every damn time. And it is the hardest effing thing to break. It is the hardest thing to break. That bias is so fixed, so solid in us that it's constantly seeking confirmation. So just as you were saying, Louis, like when someone likes me, clearly there's something wrong with them. Right? Why? Because it's confirming a bias. It's the bias is that there is something wrong with me. There is no talking through that. You can't change the bias by endlessly talking about it or trying to change your feelings about it. It's helpful for the awareness. It's helpful for the learning about your type, but it doesn't get to change. Change happens when you finally, so we say this, information's head space, inspiration's heart space, transformation's body space. Like you actually have to act out differently. And that's what rewires the brain because then you create new experiences. But it takes a whole lot of faith because everything in you saying that is not going to work. That is not satisfying. That is not what and I'm not going to get my need met. And all that's happening. And so by acting against the bias, by saying, I choose like you're doing, and you're already doing it. You're like, okay, I'm going to go toward the person rather than away. I'm going to invite them into my withdrawn space. That's perfect. Those are the habits of, I'm going to keep working against that. So you're already doing a lot of that, Louis. It's just that there's certain monsters that are bigger than others and they take a while to come down. We all have them. And so that's the stuff of growth and process, but you're doing wonderfully. I mean, based on what I'm hearing, you've got some tremendous insight and practices that will continue to develop and grow. So all I would say is just recognize what you've already done. You've already begun the transformation process. So celebrate that. And you fours, man, you fours, you focus on so much on what isn't than what is, on what is missing than what you already have. And part of it is retraining your brain to focus on, what do I already have? What have I already accomplished? What are the wins already happening in my life? Right? But you got to learn to trust the happy and the positive a little bit more. Like, hey, celebrate me. I've done it. Right? That helps the mind. That helps the brain to go, I like that. I want to repeat that. If you focus on the negative, that draws away the energy from growth. So,
yeah, I mean, Joel just said exactly what I was going to highlight, which is, well, you're doing exactly what you need to do. And I've had this conversation with so many different 4 clients where it's just kind of like, but when will it start to feel different? So that's the biggest differentiation, is like, when will my experience of it be different? And the honest answer to that is I have no idea. The way our brain is wired is that the ones that fire together, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so it takes a long time to kind of deprogram and reprogram and to have those to the experience. But there's a story that's always going to be saying, but I'm not there, right? But if you are doing the thing, what you very much said, like, I don't believe it's going to make a difference if I go to the gym, if I break this cycle this way. I don't believe it's going to make a difference, but it does. Then you are absolutely 100% doing the very thing that is going to eventually change your experience. But I can't give you a when. I can't tell you when you're going to experience it different, but the what you are doing is exactly spot on.
Thank you so very much to each of you for opening up your hearts, sharing so vulnerably and openly, and just for all the beautiful insights as well that you've given to us. I am so enriched by this conversation, and I believe a lot of other folks will be too.
Thank you so much. This is going to be amazing. And from the bottom of our hearts, you have touched hearts, and you have touched ours. And so many people are going to feel a little bit more normal from listening to you, a little bit more balanced, and have a lot more hope of where they can go because of what you shared. So thank you so much. It's been an honor talking to you. Thanks for listening to this episode. You can follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter at theartofgrowth.org. You can also go there to sign up for the community or to reach out to us for coaching. But hey, since you're here, why not stick around for another episode? Grace and growth, my friends.